Well, let's take a closer look now with Dwight Duncan, a former Ontario Deputy Premier and Finance Minister in the McGuinty Liberal government. He also knows Windsor very well, and that's where he's joining me from. Mr. Duncan, good to see you.
Good to see you, Andrew.
You know, you dealt with big automakers as a minister, and right now we have Stellantis saying the federal government has not delivered what was agreed to, that the company is looking at contingency plans that presumably don't include Windsor. What do you make of what we're hearing from Stellantis right now?
Well, there's a serious issue that has come into play since this plant was first announced, and that's the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which has upped the ante on how much money governments are going to be called upon to put into these projects. I know the federal government has been talking to Stellantis since before the Volkswagen announcement. I know that these negotiations have been ongoing. I know that Stellantis is a big company with a huge investment that could very easily move to the United States. So make no mistake, we're in a very tenuous position right now. I believe Canada's handling this properly. We've all got to get used to either dealing with this new world, or if you choose to get out of it, just realize that all these jobs that are going to be created, not just at Stellantis, but in many other places, will bypass Canada and, more importantly, from our immediate perspective, Ontario.
So do you think this is the new normal then, that Canadian governments are going to have to be dealing with at various levels in dealing with these large production subsidies coming from the Biden administration, as long as that Inflation Reduction Act remains in place?
Absolutely. And again, you know, listen, this is a lot of money. There's no question. But I'll remind you, back 12 years ago, we put not quite this much, but between the federal government and Ontario, we put a heck of a lot of money into both General Motors and Chrysler to keep those companies afloat. And so with this change, you know, I was frankly surprised that the provincial government only put $500 million into the Volkswagen plant in St. Thomas. They're going to have to come to the table the way Ontario always has. You know, $500 million out of, you know, say it's somewhere between 9 and 11 billion for argument's sake. That's not nearly as close as the typical Ontario contribution has been by both Conservative and Liberal governments and NDP governments in this province in the past.
Well, I want to get your take on that on the political side of this, because we've got different levels of government talking to each other, saying the other side needs to be stepping up. Doug Ford says he doesn't have the federal government's spending power, that Ontario is, as you say, offering the same amount to Stellantis as to Volkswagen. Meanwhile, here in Ottawa, we've heard the finance minister saying federal resources aren't infinite and that it is the Ontario government that has to step up. So what do you make of the fact that we're hearing all this in public?
Well, this is what happens when you know, a government tries to take credit for something and doesn't put enough money in. I mean, the situation in Ontario has always been that the provincial government has stepped up much more than the Ford government is. If they want to preserve this investment in Windsor, they ought to come back to the table. In my experience, you know, we put, I think it was $9 billion federal, $5 billion provincial into the Chrysler and General Motors bailouts back in 08, 09. You know, every major plant in Ontario just go up and down the 401. You had Ford Essex Engine here in Windsor, federal, provincial government participation, Toyota, which our government did. You know, there's been a raft of other investments. So, you know, the Ford government has got to, in my view, should be making the auto sector a greater priority right now. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This amount of money that's invested will be paid back very quickly in the form of taxes, employment, and all that goes with it. If Premier Ford wants to see it in Indianapolis, that's what's going to happen. And I'm quite certain that the federal government is quite prepared to work. I remember Premier Ford was here when we announced the Stellantis plant, and taking credit duly, they put 50% of that amount in. Now they're being called on for more. I was astounded at how little they put into the Volkswagen plant, and this is certainly his province that I represented as well. His province gains, and this is why Ontario's always been the only subnational jurisdiction involved in these sorts of things. His government will be the biggest beneficiary. The auto industry is almost entirely centered here in Ontario. The nice thing about the EV piece is that we will be needing more minerals, not only from Northern Ontario, but other provinces. But make no mistake, his government benefits, and that's why our government didn't hesitate to put the I think it was $4.9 billion into the General Motors and Chrysler bailouts. And those companies have continued to employ people, continued to pay taxes. And when this new development of EVs came along, they already have their footprint here. So it's incumbent, in my view, on all governments to work together, save the cheap political shots that we heard from the Premier yesterday and from others, and just get down to the hard bargaining. I think there's an opportunity here. I'm confident, as the Deputy Prime Minister was, as Minister Champagne said apparently today in Seoul, that we'll get this done. But make no mistake, the Americans play for keeps, and they probably got $1 billion in the ground here in Windsor. I mean, it's a huge piece right now. But if they get $11 billion from the U.S., they'll just walk away. And I think everyone needs to take that seriously. And I suspect, too, Stellantis has been, I shouldn't say I suspect, Stellantis has been talking to the federal government since prior to the Volkswagen announcement, as I understand it. And those talks have been ongoing. I have a feeling they're getting impatient. Believe me, I remember dealing with Chrysler when they were in no position to play hardball, saying to me, if you folks don't come to the table, we'll take all of our production in Ontario. At that time, it was Brampton and Windsor, and we'll move it to St. Louis.
All right,
and it was that stark.
All right, well, we do have to leave it there, and certainly we'll see how these talks play out in the coming days and weeks. Dwight Duncan, I want to thank you for your insight on this tonight.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure to join you.